Brad comes in my cube one day and says, I have this idea for the logo, and he described it. And basically it was putting a logo that would sort of distinguish the feature animated movie and sort of throw back to this rich history of animation that Warner Brothers has. And so I put something together. And it was, I just got a scene folder, scanned it, and painted up a shield, and threw it together as an animatic. But it started out as an uphill battle getting this logo, and everyone was saying, don't work on it, don't spend any time on it, because we're never going to use it. And then I got a call from Brad on the lot saying, you know, hey, they're going to maybe use it. Where is it? And you know, I still had it just as an animatic, not ready for film at all. So that was a 3-day crunch getting that thing ready to go, and they used it.
Our production designer, Mark Whiting, had done some concepts drawings for it before I got involved. But I wanted to go in a very different direction, and I thought of Joe. He came up with some really great early concepts, which then Mark Whiting took and really fleshed out with Steve Markowski.
I wanted to make him very simple and almost childlike, you know, build him out of as simple, keep the shapes as simple as possible, basically. He's made of, you know, cylinders and cones and spheres and, you know, squares. I wanted to keep his proportions overall very humanistic, but I wanted to give him sort of like Popeye forearms, you know, skinny upper arms and large forearms, and do the similar thing with his legs, because it's something that you can do in steel that you can't do in flesh. I wanted to immediately give him the distinction of being a machine, but with more or less human proportions overall.
Joe Johnson did a series of really beautiful, about yay big, from what I remember, black and white silhouettes of giants, maybe 15 or 20 of them. And Brad showed them to me, and I kind of leafed through them, and I grabbed one that felt right to me. And I started doing this painting. And at the time, I'd kind of left his upper torso in shadow. And one of the things I took off the silhouette that I liked was the crotch area of the giant, where you know, he's exposed and it's just gears. The silhouette that I was working from was sort of too C-3PO. It was like a guy in a suit, but it had the right personality. I just kind of dragged everything a little larger and tighter and tried to make the sizes more extreme, and gave him big rivets, you know, big bolts, made him look like iron. Joe brought back his drawing, and it had, you know, sort of a compromise of like his drawing and my painting, but it was still, everything was still like round. All his forearm stuff was round, and that's when I took that drawing of his and basically created the giant you see in the movie. We sort of married the two. I kept a lot of his features, but I just heavied it off. I just clumped it off so it felt more industrial. Being an iron giant, it sort of dictated to me that it should feel like a locomotive, like a heavy riveted steam engine kind of deal.
The Iron Giant was originally brought to Warner Brothers by Pete Townsend and Des McAnuff as a project to do as a musical.
I was working with Pete Townsend on Tommy, which we did on Broadway and on the West End and all over the world. And Pete was developing his album, The Iron Man, into a theatrical project for the Young Vic, a theater company in Britain, and asked me basically for my advice. So I took his script for The Iron Man and his album and the book. It's based on a book by Ted Hughes, of course, called The Iron Man. And when I finished looking at this material, I had a meeting with him, and I said, you know, frankly, I think this is an animated feature. And I then went to Warner Brothers with this idea. The Warner's folks decided they liked the idea, and off we went.
Warner Brothers Feature Animation asked me if there was anything in the projects they had in development, and they had like 35, 40 projects, a lot, in various stages of development. The one that really jumped out at me was Iron Giant. I read the original Hughes book and responded to it. I mean, you know, there was something really elemental and strong about this little boy and this giant metal man. But I had a different idea. I started thinking about machines and people and our relationship to technology, and I came up with this notion of asking myself, what if a gun had a soul?
He's a piece of hardware, Hogarth. He's a machine designed to kill.
I pitched it at Warner Brothers with Pete Townsend there. And I think Pete had sort of twin reactions. I think that on one hand, I think that he was intrigued by several of these ideas, but I think he was also kind of horrified that it was sort of becoming very different than the movie he originally set out to make. Pete didn't know me from Adam at this point, and I think that he really took a leap of faith to trust me, and Des did too, to develop this in a way that would, you know, do him proud and do the work that he had and Des had put into it proud.
Ted was wildly enthusiastic about Brad's treatment for the story and finally the script. Ted sadly died before the picture came out, so we never got to see the movie. Brad then brought Tim into the project to work on the script with him, feeling that he needed a collaborator.
In a way, this was sort of a throwback to the old days of Disney when the stories were worked out by they call story guys, which they worked out on storyboards first, and you know, before they ever wrote the script. We would see things that the storyboard guys had done, and usually, of course, they'd give a storyboard guy, you know, maybe a 3 to 6 minute scene. He would come up with 30 minutes worth of stuff, you know, great stuff, you know, and so it became just a great collaboration between Brad, you know, all these storyboard guys and myself, just coming up with great ideas. And Allison was, you know, the third member of this great, you know, team with Brad.
For me, it was a really dynamic, wonderful time on the movie because Brad was working with the writer and working with the storyboard guys, and it was just a dynamic sort of interchange between the two groups. And sort of over the course of the next few months, the first draft of the script came to be, utilizing some of the work that the storyboard guys had done and the writer and Brad, and it was just a real dynamic time.
It began as kind of a nail-biting experience for me because I was kind of sticking my neck out with these guys, Pete and Des, who are amazing in their you know, achievements, both of them. And you know, I was kind of saying, I want to go this slightly different way, and they endorsed it, and I think we had a happy ending.
I think the important thing that Ted produced in the book is this extraordinary relationship between Hogarth and this huge metallic creature. And I think that's the great power of the movie. You know, I think the social commentary is fabulous, and the political parallels are very interesting. But when it comes right down to it, what's really powerful is this extraordinary relationship. That's what will make this film timeless.
It's easy to design something that's really cool looking, but the hard part is getting some personality into the design, you know, especially something that's, you know, made of iron and 100 feet tall.
We knew that this thing was going to be animated and that it needed to be something that could have a range of emotions. The idea of these shutters on the giant's eye being able to come down and tilt them in different directions. They could either work as eyelids or eyebrows, depending on whether you used the top ones and or the bottom ones only, could make it almost appear like a cheek does when you go like this. And so the fact that we could rotate these things and keep them very simple and backlight them with the giant's eyes gave us an incredible range of expression with very little, very few design elements. So that was a big epiphany, I thought.
And the other thing was the jaw. And I think this actually came from Steve Markowski, where it would unhinge and it would wiggle and change, and then you could arc, you know, the jaw down. And it also is largely dependent on the expression you get from the giant, is the camera angle. You know, if you're shooting up at him, it's going to give him more of a sad face because the curve is going to be going down. And if you're shooting down on him, it'll look a little more like he's smiling. That, coupled with the loosening of the jaw and the eyes, is really how we gave it expression.
Because when it's like 50, 75 feet tall, you don't want people to be afraid of him. You know, you want the townspeople, but you want a boy to go, wow, this is great. It looks friendly in a way, but then when you make the transition of discovering what the potential, you know, what actually the robot was designed for, you want to get into this idea of just looking at it, that you know that this is trouble. And that's sort of the quandary for the giant, and going back to that initial concept that Brad had was, what if a gun had a soul?
So much of the movie that you see on the screen is it's all created in the storyboard process.
The boarding process, I think, was leaner and meaner than most animated features, and it's probably partly due to the fact that Jeff Lynch and I, and Brad Bird and I, we all came from television. We were working on Simpsons, where things had to be much leaner, meaner, faster, quicker.
Not only with an animated film do you want to see the reels completed, you want to see it playing out. The reels are especially full. They're called animatics. There's actually movement, you know, that Andrew Menace is a genius at this.
The use of animatics in Iron Giant was to pre-visualize in a very complete way what a shot was going to look like very early on, before the shot really ever went into production, and that included splitting storyboard artwork into multiple levels, splitting characters off backgrounds, and then splitting single drawn backgrounds into multiple layers so that we could do multiplanes. And this served sort of multiple functions of communicating to the lot very early on what the film was basically going to look like before it went into production. And also internally, as far as making the movie, in story, it allowed us to basically, in the same way, see what it was going to look like before it went into production, and that was, you know, multiplaning camera moves, temp effects, even sort of rough lighting. All these things sort of enabled us to see what it was going to look like, because the camera telling the story was, you know, very much a part of the storytelling process.
Animatics with Brad, Jeff, and Andy was just such great fun, because we really got into filmmaking. I mean, from the start, from boarding, we were into the filmmaking of composition and what the camera's doing, and the cinematography, and then taking right that animatics where it's pretty much realized with what Andy was doing with separating elements in the drawing and making a move. And I mean, it was, you know, barring animating it, I mean, it was close to the finished picture as possible. After that, once these scenes went into production, they served another function of communicating to the whole building what the shot was going to look like, the timing, sort of what the effects were going to look like, lighting. People could punch up the shot on the webpage and look at it.
The old Disney guys would do these incredible storyboards, but they were really about just telling the story. There was a separate department that did the staging. How do you show it? And Brad really folds it all in. You know, your staging and your storytelling, they all happen at the same time.
Dean Wellens ended up boarding more than half the film himself, and then went on to animate more scenes in the film than anyone else. So we nicknamed him the Clydesdale, because he carried so much work on his shoulders.
I think a lot of storyboards in the past of other studios tends to be more of like a little cartoon strip where they just kind of get the idea out there. And usually the difference between the storyboards and then the final animation is the, you know, leaps and bounds. Iron Giant, I mean, we would literally be taking drawings right from the storyboard and putting it into the scene, because our storyboards are really tight that way.
You can fly?
In the script, it was just one line of dialogue that said, "The biggest, most expensive, powerful, rip-roaring action scene animation has ever seen in their entire existence." That was the line that I had to get forth in the storyboards. So that's kind of a daunting task when it, falls right in my lap. So I just start boarding and put everything in the kitchen sink in there that I could even think of, that I would even want to see, that would be cool. And we went through several versions of the final battle before we actually got to the one that ended up on screen.
This is another area of the film, if I were to have my perfect version, I would have had this scene go on maybe a minute or two longer, because we had great stuff that we simply couldn't afford.
It was gigantic. We had a Stratofortress try and carpet bomb the Giant. We had more F-86s try and strafe the Giant. The Giant burst through a forest onto a highway that's ice-slicked, slips and nearly falls on all the cars that are on the highway. We had it fall into the ocean where submarines attacked it. So it was just everything we threw into the final battle. Brad, when I originally pitched it, where we were near the end, he looked at it and he said, "All right, Mark, this is great. It's awesome. It's really working well. Now let's take it down a third."
It always seemed to become ungainly, and they started making fun of me because I kept saying, "Cut it in half." The first thing I would always say whenever they showed me anything in the battle sequence was, "Cut it in half." And it was because every time I would leave them with it, we would cut it down, and then it would sprawl out again. It was like the sequence that will not, be contained.
We got F-86 fighter planes, we got the tanks, we got Jeeps with 30mm machine guns, we've got howitzers, we've got the ground troops with bazookas and machine guns, and just anything that I could think of, from different war movies. The message we wanted to drive home with the final battle was just, you can't stop the robot. The military shows up, they have everything brought to bear against the robot, but that is not even remotely enough, as this thing is invincible, it can't be stopped. So that when Hogarth finally breaks through the programming of the robot, and the robot remembers who he is, it's just that, that David and Goliath, this little boy was able to stop the robot.